All right. Good morning, everyone. I think we are ready to start, given the fact that we are super sensitive to all your time. And thanks again for joining. I know everyone is busy, especially at the beginning of a new year, but delighted that you could make some time to join us to focus on data responsibility for refugee children. And how do we go from principles to practices? Delighted to be able to have you all join. And as already mentioned, my name is Stefaan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of the GovLab. And I'm here joined with two of my colleagues, Sarah Marcucci, who is a research fellow at the GovLab, and Andrew Zahuranik, who is also a research fellow at the GovLab. And they will both join me and support me throughout this session. And if you have any challenges with whatever, whether it's with Slido or whether it's with adding a question to the Q&A, which is the way we're gonna communicate with each other, let them know via either email or via the Q&A as well. For those who don't know the GovLab, we are an action research center. We are based in New York, but we have a global footprint. And our mission is to look into how can we transform the way we make decisions? How do we transform the way we design policies? How do we transform the way we solve problems? And how do we transform the way we design public services, including services at a time of crisis, leveraging new technologies and new science? And obviously, data is a critical part of the way we can transform the way we go about solving public problems, but we can only do so if we do so in a responsible way. And that's also one of the areas that we have focused on for the last kind of few years, on how can we leverage data in a responsible way to change the way we go about solving public problems, responding to crises, and of course, doing so in a more legitimate, but also more effective way. Now, luckily, we are not, of course, doing this by ourselves. We are doing this with a whole range of partners. And today, what we will present is the result of a collaboration between two important partners from our side. On the one hand, UNICEF, and on the other hand, of course, UNHCR. And I'm delighted to be joined today by two of the outstanding representatives of those organizations. On the one hand, Eugenia Olliaro, who is a program specialist at UNICEF here in the New York headquarters, and Rachelle Cloutier, who is a senior data policy officer, also based at the headquarters of UNHCR as well. And so before I start and dive into the substance, let me ask Eugenia, I think, or and we're also joined, by the way, with Krisana Messerli. But let me ask Krisana or Eugenia to provide some opening remarks.
So good morning and good afternoon, colleagues. Many thanks for being here today. My name is Krisana, and I am part of the Responsible Data for Children team here at UNICEF headquarters. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today and to be part of this joint collaboration between UNICEF, UNHCR, and the GovLab. Now, all of us use and generate data in our everyday work. However, data for and about children, refugee children specifically, requires special care because of the additional layers of vulnerabilities that are associated with being forcibly displaced. Applying the principles of data responsibility is critical, therefore, and to manage the data in a safe, ethical, and effective manner, and in ways that are aligned with refugee children's best interests. This is why, as part of the Blueprint for Joint Action Initiative, which was launched in January 2020, and which is now being replaced by the Strategic Collaboration Framework, we as UNICEF, UNHCR, and the GovLab have been collaborating to strengthen our institutional data practices when it comes to data for and about refugee children specifically. In 2022, we have had the great opportunity to collaborate with UNICEF and UNHCR in Uganda to promote the responsible handling of data for and about refugee children in the country. Together with national and community leaders, with government officials and the refugees themselves, we identified data challenges affecting the handling of data related specifically to mental health and psychosocial services in refugee settlements. and we co-developed paid solutions to address these challenges. We can share a link of the report in the chat, so you can have a look at it later. So today we as UNICEF, UNHCR and the GovLab will host this 90-minute webinar on how you as humanitarian practitioners from all around the world can reinforce data responsibility principles and practices in your daily work when you seek to address the needs of refugee children. There will be another third session, exactly like this one tomorrow, just so we can cover multiple time zones. So if you would like to forward the link to this invitation, that would be most welcome to any colleagues that you think could benefit from participating in this conversation. So many thanks again for being here today with us, and back over to you, Stefaan.
Great. Thanks so much, Krisina, for jumping in, and impressed with the resiliency from the UNICEF team. If one fails, then the other can jump in immediately. So much appreciated as well. So what will we do today? Well, thanks again for joining. And so what we hope to do today is to give you insight with regard to, first of all, what is data responsibility? Why does it matter? And why now? And then we will hone in on the specific question, which is probably why you all joined today. What is data responsibility in the context of refugee children? Because obviously what we hope to explore is, do refugee children require additional attention? And if so, why? And what we specifically will focus on are what are the principles that can guide you as the North Star to make decisions with regard to how to design initiatives that manage data in a way that are responsible as it relates to refugee children. But not only what are principles, which is of course super important to have, because as I said, that allows you to know what good looks like, but also how do we then translate that into practice. And so we hope today in 90 minutes to really give you some insight with regard to, first of all, what is data responsibility, and specifically, what is data responsibility within the context of humanitarian action and response and preparedness. But then we really hone in on what is responsibility as it relates to refugee children, which of course requires additional attention. Now, the work that I will present today is, as already mentioned, the result of collaboration between, on the one hand, UNICEF and UNHCR in the GovLab, but also it is based upon work that has been done by many others. One key actor in the space of data responsibility for humanitarian action is, of course, the Interagency Standing Committee, which is a committee that brings together most actors of the humanitarian sector and tries to focus on how can we provide guidance on how to leverage and manage data in a responsible way. And so a lot of what I will discuss today is based upon their operational guidance that recently, last year, was updated. And for those who are interested in getting the full flavor, which of course I cannot provide you in 90 minutes because it's a way more comprehensive document, I suggest you go to the document and to the link that we will share in the slides as well. Now, in addition to ISAC, which of course is the way we describe the Interagency Standing Committee, we also, of course, are leverage and share some of the work that we have been doing in the context of Responsible Data for Children initiative, which is an initiative that was co-founded by UNICEF and the GovLab, and that specifically focuses on responsible data for children, not only in the context of humanitarian action and response, but also in broader context. And so what we hope to do today is to actually bring those two principles and perspectives and guidances together and apply it to, on the one hand, humanitarian context, because as I said, responsible data for children goes beyond humanitarian, but we try to base ourselves upon the ISAC guidance as well, and then specifically hone in on why are refugee children different in the context of responsible data, and why is it even more important to leverage and manage data responsibly when it comes to data. So why do we care about data in general? Well, all of you probably are working with data on a daily basis, mainly because without data, it's very hard to achieve your mission. Specifically, it's very hard without data to actually be meaningful when it comes to strategic planning. So one of the first value propositions in the humanitarian context on why we need data is, of course, to do better strategic planning, but also to improve the way we do programming, specifically with regard to response delivery, and then subsequently reporting on what happened well, and what can we learn from ultimately action that we conducted in the field. Now, without data, it's also very hard to make the case for change. And so data is a critical element, a critical asset for advocacy, to make the case that more resources are needed, or that we need to rearrange our targets, rearrange our focus as well. And then lastly, of course, none of this can happen without resources. And again, without data, it's very hard to make the case for more resources, but also very hard to know where resources are needed and how we can mobilize and distribute resources in a more efficient and effective way as well. So data is essential, right? Data is ultimately a critical element of humanitarian action. But that is radically changing as well. Not the need for data, but the way data is being produced and the way data is being stored, the way we analyze data, and the way we start relying on data is fundamentally changing as a result of digitalization that has led to a massive datafication as such. And of course, given the fact that we have ever more data, that we have ever more ways to store the data, and then subsequently to analyze the data, just think about the current focus on artificial intelligence, for instance. That also means that, of course, we have an increased data capacity. And of course, we can argue about how to increase it even more, but that's not the focus of today. But if we are increasing, and if we have an increased data capacity, that also means that we actually need to invest more in how to then leverage that capacity in a more responsible, in a legitimate and effective manner as well. And that's why data responsibility is super important today, as we are entering a new kind of data era that is driven by changes in both the instrumentation, but also in other aspects as well. But I've been talking about data responsibility now for a while, for making the case that we need to invest in data responsibility. And I think that's now clear for everyone, and was probably already clear for all of you, otherwise you wouldn't have joined today's session. But what do we mean when we talk about data responsibility? And so here, that's where we are trying to get your sense on what you mean by data responsibility. And so if you could go to Slido, and so slido.com on your browser, and I know multitasking, especially when you watch a Zoom, might be hard to do. But if you can open up another window and go to slido.com and put in the event code, which is here on the screen, then you will enter our small interactive kind of community there. And what I would like you to reflect on is really, what words or terms do you associate when you hear the term data responsibility? Because it's also important to get a sense on what you believe data responsibility comprises of before we go into the definition of ISAC and really try to hone in on kind of the three components that ISAC has been featuring as key to determine what is data responsibility within the context of a humanitarian action as well. Thanks for those that already have joined. So indeed, confidentiality seems to feature centrally. Protection, rights, ethics, best interest of the child, validation, interesting, integrity, empowerment, anonymization. Again, confidentiality seems to resonate with many. Anonymization again. Rights-based, non-divulgation, interesting. Data literacy, yeah, without literacy, it's very hard to also know what to do. Great. So thanks for, and consent from child, interesting. So thanks for those that have added the their words. And so let's see how that resonates with how ISAC defines the concept of and the practice of data responsibility. And you will see that many of you, of course, probably are already ISAC readers, because many of you obviously already emphasized some of the elements that ISAC also defines as data responsibility. And so according to ISAC, data responsibility in humanitarian action is the safe, ethical, and effective management of personal and non-personal data, and I think it's important to take both into account, for operational response in accordance with established frameworks for personal data protection. And so as you can see, a lot of the words that were mentioned were also already in the definition. And so there are three core elements that I think is a worthwhile reflecting on a little bit more, that also were featured in the definition, but also that many of you have shared. And so you will see that those words are kind of part of the broader definition. The first one is, of course, safe. So data responsibility is about data management activities that ensure the security of data at all times, that respect and uphold human rights and other legal obligations. And I think it's important that it also indeed it is important to emphasize that data responsibility is also about rights of individuals. And of course, what we will see in the context of refugee children, it's also about the rights of refugee children, of course, that need to be upheld. And of course, do no cause, do no harm is, of course, a fundamental principle of every humanitarian action that needs to be aligned with. And so these are the elements that provides for a safe data management environment. But it's not only safe, it's also about being ethical, which means that data management activities are aligned with the established frameworks and standards for humanitarian ethics. And again, it's important because the definition is not just about data responsibility in the abstract. This is really about data responsibility as it relates to humanitarian action. And of course, in the context of refugees, for instance, it's even more important to emphasize that, of course, you also need to align and comply with the humanitarian principles and humanitarian ethics that guide all the work, but also then specific with data ethics. And then the third element that is emphasized in the definition is, of course, being effective, because it's not about just being safe and ethical. It's also making sure, A, that data is actually used in a way that makes a difference, because otherwise, what's the point of actually having data, and what's the point of putting potentially people at harm if not managed responsibly as well. And so that means that there is an obligation to also be well coordinated and, more importantly, to achieve the purpose for which they were carried out. Because without actually having a clear purpose, and more importantly, we will come back to that, but also without being able to document that the purpose was met, then we can also argue that that was not actually a responsible use of data, because it failed to actually achieve the purpose as well. So these are the three components that are used to define data responsibility, and we will see many of the principles that we will reflect on throughout this 90 minutes are really going back to the definition and are making it more kind of concrete, and also provide more guidance on how we actually go about this. But it's also important to say, and many of you already in the Slido also mentioned the concept of protection, and especially data protection. But it's important to say that indeed data protection is part of data responsibility, specifically as it relates to managing personal data. That's when the data protection principles especially come into force. But data responsibility is also broader than that, because it also goes into the ethical aspects and into the aspects of being effective, for instance, as well. And of course, data security is also part of data responsibility, specifically when we go about securing personal and non-personal data as well. But again, data responsibility is broader than just data protection and data security, but data security and data protection are part of it as well. And we will see they specifically come into play when we focus on particular kind of scenarios, such as, for instance, managing personal data when those data protection principles comes into play as well. Now, before we go into the principles on how do we actually achieve data responsibility, now that we have a definition of what we mean in the humanitarian sector, what data responsibility means, let's first reflect on refugee children, because today it's not anyway about data responsibility in general within the context of humanitarian action. Today we specifically want to focus on why does data responsibility even matter more when it comes to refugee children. And again, before we go into kind of the reasons that informed all of us here as the organizing team, the reasons why we felt it important to feature and focus on refugee children, let's first have you all reflect on why you believe children require dedicated attention. Why do refugee children face unique risks when it comes to data? And so eager to hear from all of you why it matters to focus on data responsibility in the context of refugee children. And I think that's probably the number of Slido that is featuring centrally here. So for those who want to join, that's the number. Oops. Right, they are more vulnerable than others. Indeed, vulnerability is key, of course. And again, vulnerable, high vulnerability, discrimination can be illegal to gather data, or political risks. Again, vulnerable is what most agree on here. Rights again, children's rights. Consent challenges, indeed, much harder to obtain informed consent from children because they quite often have less agency, of course, and have even delegated consent situations where someone else provides consent for them. Different degrees of agency, and of course, that indeed depends on the age group, because this is a large age group, of course, children, but still agency is less direct agency for the decisions that affect them, easily to be exploited. Again, it contributes to their notion of vulnerability as well. At higher risks and have multiple specific needs in general, indeed, especially for certain kind of context where children suffer more than others. Great. So thanks. Thanks for that. It seems like vulnerable is the the name and the reason why most of you have that most of you associated with the need for specific attention as it relates to the use of data and managing data for refugee children. And indeed, that's also the reason why we organized today's session, because children are indeed more vulnerable and have less agency than adults when it comes to data. Because in general, but specifically when it comes to managing data, they are in a more vulnerable position than others, and their interests may often be overlooked. Now, of course, this is not the case for everyone here on the call who have spent their lives quite often on making sure that the interests of children are being adhered to, but quite often children are not in the room when decisions are made. And as a result, the question is, of course, anyway, who represents them, and are their interests actually taken into account? And that's why it's important to make sure that data responsibility in the humanitarian sector takes also the unique vulnerabilities of children into account. Now, the other reason why data responsibility matters is because, and some of you mentioned confidentiality there in the Slido as well, when children feel that their data is not safe, is not managed in an ethical way, that the data is not confidential, they might fear that the data can be misused to harm them. And as a result, that fear and that mistrust will lead to what quite often is called privacy protective behavior, by which we mean is that they will actually not seek out services because they fear that if they seek out services, data might might potentially be collected and then subsequently misused, or might potentially harm them, whether it's harm them at the moment or whether it's harm them in their future lives as well. And so it's super important to make sure that children trust the data collection, the way we manage data, because that will also lead to them trusting the services that are provided, that are based upon the data that is being collected as well. And so without data responsibility, we have a reduced ability to plan and deliver services. But there are other reasons as well. And again, we're just going to summarize a few of them because there are many more than those. But the other reason is quite often that if we are not designing the collection of data or the way data is managed in a proper, ethical, and appropriate manner, it might actually lead to new traumas, or it might revisiting traumas. Many children in the context of humanitarian crisis are already traumatized. And if we then start collecting data, asking questions so that they relive their trauma, then subsequently that may harm them more than actually it benefits them. And so it's super important to think about how data is managed, and more importantly, how we design the way we collect data, what are the questions we ask, and who are the ones that we are asking the questions. Now, the other reason is that children are also at the forefront of digitalization. I cannot think of any other generation that has been more datafied than the current new generations. Meaning before, it was much harder to collect data. Now children, the moment they are born and the moment they are starting using digital devices, leave a trail of data that potentially can be misused as well. And so it's super important to think about how we manage data in the context of massive data collection as it relates to children. And then the last one, and I guess then we have made the case for sure, there is a strong relationship between privacy and children's self-development, meaning that if there is no privacy, then quite often that also means that children are limited in their autonomy. And if children are limited in their autonomy, they are quite often show certain kind of behavior that is in their best interest to actually test out and experiment with. And so self-development might be hampered because children don't behave in ways that actually they learn from. And so that's another reason why it is super important to think about data responsibility in the context of children as well. So we define data responsibility in the context of humanitarian action. We made the case that, and of course, many of you already had emphasized that as well in your Slido, but we made the case that children, and specifically refugee children, require additional attention. So then the question is, of course, what are the principles for responsible data management in humanitarian setting? And principles are quite often poo-wooed as it's just principles, but principles are super important because, as I already mentioned, they provide the North Star. They give you a sense on what good looks like. And more importantly, it gives you also a framework to actually make decisions, because without principles, we are quite often at a loss on what are kind of the norms, the principles that should inform how we go about making decisions, especially in a context when we need to make decisions fast, and especially in a context when there are multiple options that can be explored that need to be informed in a way that actually align with principles of good practice and principles of data responsibility. And as I said, what we're going to do today is basically try to distill the core messages that emerge from those two sets of principles that have been developed by, on the one hand, ISAC, and by the other hand, the Responsible Data for Children. ISAC has come up with 12 principles in a comprehensive manner to guide action in the humanitarian setting. And these are the 12 that have been and that are featuring in their operational guidance. And again, we're going to put a link in the chat as well so that you can study them and be aware of them in more detail. And then these are the ones that the Responsible Data for Children has provided, and there are 7 of them that really provide for guidance in a way that is flexible, but also principle-led as well. And these have also now been used more and more in different kinds of contexts as well. Now, what we hope to do today, as I mentioned, is to really hone in on those principles, explain them, and then turn them into how do you go about them into practice. But we're not going to go through 12 plus 7. We've tried to basically distill the core messages that are common and that you need to take into account when starting to use data for refugee children. And the first one, super important, but again, they're all important because it's a package. It's not like you can choose one and then just use one and declare victory. It's really about how do you make sure they consider all the principles as a package in how you go about designing and managing data initiatives. The first one is about having a clear and proportional purpose. Because without a clear, defined, and communicated purpose, it's very hard to communicate about what is it that you are doing, but more importantly, it's very hard to then steer what needs to be collected and what is really necessary as well. And so a clearly defined and communicated purpose can help practitioners avoid over-collecting and misusing data. It can achieve a goal more effectively because you actually know what you need to collect and need to manage, as opposed to let's collect something and hope that it will give us the insight that we need. But if you haven't done the extra homework to really define what is it that you need and what's the purpose, it's going to be very hard to actually have data that can help you as well. Now, those purposes should be explicit, so they should be clearly indicate why you need the data. It should be proportional, meaning it should really indicate what needs to be collected and what's the method that is appropriate for collecting, so that you don't collect everything and hope that in the noise you will identify a kind of a signal, and it should be reasonable as well. And data ought to be relevant. So if you start collecting data for that purpose, it should be limited for that purpose, which is of course a core principle of data minimization. So you only collect the data, or you only manage or have access to the data that actually can meet the purpose, which is super important for when you define the purpose to actually also define a question so that you know what is actually needed to answer that question. And it should be adequate to what is necessary for achieving the intended purposes. So the key message here is to have a clear purpose that reflects necessity, right? That then reflects what is actually needed. And that, of course, might be hard to do. And we will come back to that in a second on how that can be operationalized as well. Now, the second one is to be fair, accountable, and transparent. And that goes really about, anyway, how do you make sure that people, and especially refugee children, will trust you? Well, they will trust you because if you are fair, accountable, and transparent and accountable, then there will also be a notion of legitimacy that emerges. And so accountability involves designing for and documenting alignment with policies and practices, managing data fairly equitably, right, so that everyone benefits from managing the data, and legitimacy. And again, legitimacy is acquired by being transparent and by being accountable as well. Guarding against bias and inappropriate or harmful activities, and ensuring that refugee children's data is managed in a transparent way so that people know this is not about transparent as in sharing the data. It's really about transparent as why you are collecting the data, how you're collecting the data, and what you will do with it as such. And so these are important principles to establish that kind of legitimacy in the space. But legitimacy also gets acquired by participation, by making sure that those that are affected can participate as well in the design or in other aspects of the data information management process as well. And so a key element here is about placing people at the center, being people-centered or people-centric. And so that means that demonstrably protect and promote refugee children's rights and interests in a transparent and inclusive way. But it's also about empowering the vulnerable. And again, we already have seen that includes, of course, children. Children are quite often the most vulnerable. And so how do we empower them? How do we empower marginalized communities in being part of actually decisions that we make as it relates to data, so that they can also determine quite often what their preferences are and how they want to be taken into account. And so that means, of course, designing data activities and systems from a people-centric perspective. Now, because we are talking about children refugees, it's also, of course, important to start thinking about not only how do we center them at the core, but also how do we make sure that we take their rights into account. And of course, when we talk about rights of children, we're talking about the Convention on the Rights of Child. And the convention basically, anyway, in a summarized form, provides for 4 important elements to be taken into account when working with children. First of all, the importance of being non-discriminatory. And that also, of course, applies to data. How do we make sure that we manage data in a non-discriminatory way? How do we make sure that we take the best interest of the child into account so that when we design a data initiative, that we actually not just design it in the way to serve your interest, but also that we design it in a way that really takes their interest into account, which means quite often that we don't, for instance, ask children the questions, but we ask other actors questions as well, so that we don't put them at risk, for instance, as well. And then we also respect children's views. As I said, quite often their views are not taken into account because they're not in the room. And so how do we go the extra mile to make sure that we know what are their preferences and expectations? And of course, protection of privacy, and already emphasized that without privacy, that might actually hamper their self-development, it might hamper, chill their behavior, and as a result, it actually undermines their potential down the line as well. Now, the other principle is then more kind of, when it comes to the data, right, it's more kind of a technical kind of principle, less of a rights principle, but it's really about promoting data quality, because without poor quality, obviously, you will have poor insights, and that in itself might actually undermine the interest and the well-being of children, because the famous saying, of course, garbage in, garbage out, one needs to prevent that as well. And so we really need to ensure data quality in terms of criteria such as accuracy. Is the data accurate? Is it complete in terms of representative as it relates to certain groups that we seek to serve? Reliability, how reliable is it actually, or was this collected in a way that is doubtful? And of course, relevance. And here, how do you know what is relevant? Well, you know what is relevant if you have a clear defined purpose. And so it's clearly linked also with the first principle, or the first message that we wanted to share. Now, in addition to quality, you also need to think about security, of course. To have very high quality data that is unauthorized access, and then you are in trouble. And children might be harmed or at risk by having actually unauthorized access to their data, or data that handles them or is about them. And so we need to think about how do we protect digital and non-digital data, so preventing unauthorized or accidental access. And that, of course, includes being super aware of cybersecurity challenges as well. How do we prevent disclosure, alteration, loss, or other forms of compromise that actually might undermine the do no harm kind of principle? And then, of course, is also, when it is super sensitive, how do we ensure confidentiality? And how do we also determine when we actually should destroy data? Because while, of course, we have seen that there's no shortage of ways to actually store data these days, it does not mean that we should keep the data forever, because the longer you keep data, the more risk there might be for unauthorized access as well. And so when should we actually, what should be our data retention as it relates to data is an important principle as well. And then ensure personal data protection, because as already mentioned, when personal data comes into play, then a whole range of additional principles kick in. And these are typically, of course, the data protection principles that quite often are already specified in existing laws in the countries that you are operating. If that's the case, then obviously data protection principle number 1 is to comply or align with the existing laws of the region or the country that specify how personal data can be used. But sometimes that also means complying it with additional additional policies, especially in countries where there is no personal data protection, then of course it's about what's the data protection policy and principle of your organization, or the organizations that you're working with as well. And so typically data protection principle starts from the principle that you need to have a legitimate basis for processing personal data. And one, for instance, most well-known legitimate basis is, of course, consent. The fact that you've asked consent to collect the data for the purpose that you have specified. And again, purpose specification is super important, even in the context of consent as well. You also need to guarantee, of course, that they are informed of their rights, and their rights include access, having access, correct, delete, or object to processing of their personal data. So I have to make sure that this not only is informed, but also that there are mechanisms in place to implement those rights. And of course, when you are designing a data management system, how do you embed privacy in the design? And so how do we get privacy by design standards from the outset, not just as an afterthought as well? And then the last principle that we will highlight here, and that kind of reflects kind of the alignment of those two set of principles that we introduced earlier, is really about how do we engage with affected populations and stakeholders. And again, this is really also about acquiring legitimacy. And as already mentioned, being transparent, being accountable, being responsible establishes legitimacy, but also being participatory, meaning engaging with the affected populations and providing them agency in how data is managed is a key element also of having not only responsible data management, but also legitimate data management approaches. And that also includes collaboration and coordination with other humanitarian actors, because without this kind of collaboration and coordination, it's very hard to also be effective, because it quite often might lead to duplication, or even it might lead to some kind of disorganized collection, which might harm everyone down the line as well. And again, it's about being transparent as well. Now, the important element is that quite often, as we have seen, especially when it comes to data protection principles, quite often there's agency at the point of collection, right, through consent. But the principle of being engaged and the participatory principle basically goes beyond that. And it really advocates that you are engaged with those that are affected across the data and information management process. So there is a potential to actually be participatory at every stage, not just at the collection stage as well. And this, of course, requires effective and timely communication. So these are kind of the core messages that reflect the similarities and the alignment across those two set of principles that we have distilled. Again, I do want to emphasize that it's important not just to take these as the only ones, but to go back to either the ISAC principles or the data for children, responsible data for children principles as kind of the root principles. But we've tried to, given the fact that we only had 90 minutes today, to really distill them in kind of a core set of principles, core set of messages for you to take into account when you start managing data, or when you are in the process of managing data for refugee children. Now, one element that I concluded with in the overview of those messages was the importance to think about applying those principles, not just at one part of the data and information management process, but to take them as guiding all decisions at every stage of the data and management process as such. And so what do we mean by data and information management process? Well, quite often I introduce this by saying that data is not an artifact, right? People quite often think of data as kind of a thing. Obviously, it is kind of an artifact, but more importantly, data is really a process. It's a process where multiple decisions are made, and then based upon those decisions, data is either managed in a safe, effective, and ethical way. And so data responsibility is really about thinking about every stage of the data management process, data and information management process, from a principled perspective. And so by data and information management process, we mean multiple stages. And of course, it starts with basically the planning stage, where you define the purpose and what is actually needed. Why do we need data in the first place, right? And again, this is seen as kind of common sense, but too often I've seen initiatives where they start collecting data because they can, or because they feel like it's something that one does, without really understanding what is the purpose. So it's super important to have a good planning, because that will determine, because as you can see, it's kind of a cascading effect. Whatever decision you make at the earlier stage will impact decisions down the line as well. And so define the purpose, then gather the data, and that could be secondary and primary data. How do you then store the data? And of course, anyway, storing, well, also means that you need to do so in kind of a secure manner that it doesn't provide potential unauthorized access. How do you clean the data? Because data quite often needs to be cleaned, and that also includes, for instance, how do we disaggregate data in terms of making sure that we know, for instance, disaggregation at the level of sex, or at the level of age, or at the level of location. How do we share the data? Because obviously, once data is collected, it can be used for other purposes, but then we need to really start thinking about how do we do this in a way that is responsible. Analyze data, because that's of course only how you can create insight. But once you have insight, then obviously you need to share the data, or share the insight, I mean, in a way that is actionable, because without action, insight, of course, is kind of not valuable and meaningless. And so how do we communicate and then subsequently use the insight in a responsible way? And then how do we evaluate? So meaning, how do we actually collect data about the use of our data in a way that it becomes data-driven as well? So these are the framework for you to think about when starting to design data initiatives in a responsible way. Framework has two components. One are the principles, and then the other aspect is, of course, the data and information management process. And so those principles can inform the decisions of every stage. And so we quickly now, in the remaining time, quickly look at how do you do this in practice. And so anyway, gonna use kind of a scenario here, which is really about a scenario on how you collect data for protection monitoring. And again, many of you probably are already involved in that as well. And so quite often data is needed to monitor, of course, whether there are issues and risks from a protection perspective as it relates to children refugees in a host country. That could include risks, for instance, as it relates to child recruitment, child labor, early marriage, family separation, or attacks on schools. And how this is collected in our scenario here is through either desk research, well, on the one hand, desk research, where you start collecting secondary data, so you become smarter about the current situation and the kind of root causes of some of those situations. But obviously there might be gaps, and so in the secondary data, and so that requires then also collecting primary data through key informant interviews as well. And of course, this is all in order to inform, and again, this goes back to one of our first slides, to inform strategic planning, programming, but also planning and adjustment, and of course, also advocacy. So if there are certain kinds of protection risks, now you have actually data that you can be used to make the case that either more resources are needed, or that attention is required, or that we need to realign our focus in a particular kind of country. And so this, anyway, again, requires thinking about the data and information management process, right? It requires to think about how we mentioned the purpose. How do we go about defining the purpose? But then, of course, there are other steps as well. And for the sake of time, I'm only going to focus on gather data, share data, and analyze very quickly, so that we also have time to address some of the questions. And so please do formulate your questions in the Q&A so that we can address that at the end as well. Now, at the gather stage, as already mentioned, here in our scenario, it's really about gathering data, primary data, in addition to secondary data, through a questionnaire where we use a mobile data collection tool such as Kobo. Many of you probably are familiar with Kobo to record the structured interview. So how do we start thinking about that from a principled approach? And so here, of course, all those principles can be and should be considered when starting to collect data. But here we're just going to focus on two. One is about making sure that you have a clear and proportional purpose. Again, I'm not going to go back to what we mean by that, but how do we make sure that we have a purpose that is well specified and also that can inform data collection in a way that is necessary for the data, for the purpose as well. And so the questions to make the principle operational, questions you can ask here are, for instance, what exactly do we need to know, right? And here it's very important to make this distinction between the need to know versus the nice to know, right? Because think about it, the more data you collect, the more potential risk there are. So it's super important to think about what is it that we need to know in order to fulfill the mission that you are set out to do or to address the question that needs to be answered as well, not what is nice to know, because that in itself might create risks as well. Then the second kind of questions are really about who will use the information to do what. So you have the decision maker into perspective. So because ultimately this is about using data to inform action. And who is going to ultimately need the insights and what kind of actions, what kind of decisions do they need to take? Super important to know that, because that also will inform, of course, the kind of information that you need. And this can also be primary and secondary users as well. Primary users, the ones that need to make decisions, and ultimately perhaps others that need to implement certain kind of action but still need data to do so. They also need to balance the expected utility with the potential risks. So it's also about understanding what might be the risks versus the benefits. And is it then cost benefit? Does it make sense? And the investment required to data proportional to make sure that the investment required is proportional to its expected use and utility. And here, I sometimes refer to make sure that you think about the minimum viable data that is needed so that it's proportional, right? That the data is minimized in a way that that are used. So how can you do this? Well, one way to do it is, for instance, to hold a multifunctional team meeting where you can actually tap into the wisdom of several actors in order to really define the purpose, and then also to understand what is really needed for different users, and to make sure that you then synthesize some of the areas to go about. Now, why do we need it? And again, I'm not going to repeat all of this. This is just to reiterate and reinforce what was mentioned earlier. But if you don't have a clear purpose and you start collecting data from or about refugee children, it might actually re-traumatize, or it might actually contribute to psychological harm. You might collect data that is not needed. So anyway, what's the point of the investment? Or it might not be used if you don't have a clear understanding of the user down the line. And that leads, of course, to inefficiencies and potentially undermining trust as well. In order to do so, there are other actions. And again, these are some of the actions that are also in the operational guidance of ISAC that I can refer to. And so they, for instance, also suggest to have a data management registry. So they actually know who is already using data that you don't start to collect so as well. Now, the other principle when it comes to gathering data is about putting people at the center. And again, I'm not going to reiterate why that is needed. How can you do this? What are the questions to ask? Well, what data sources might affected people already know about, so that you don't need to, and that could be important, for instance, when you do the desk research, that you actually understand what is actually already known. So that we don't need to start collecting data. And the ones that know probably what is already known might actually be the affected populations themselves. So that's another reason why it's important to put them at the center, to use them also as a source, not just as a way to analyze as well. What are the appropriate ways to engage child refugees in this context, given social norms, right? Some kind security conditions and protection risks, right? Super important that the context ultimately will determine what is appropriate to actually engage them, because in some cases that might put them at risk, or in some cases it might be seen as offensive as well from a social norm perspective. Are there community or civil society groups already discussing child protection issues, so that you know that others might already have answered some of the questions that you have, and how to engage them, and how could community members participate in designing and implementing? So one way to do this is to think about, anyway, how do you organize sessions so you can tap into kind of the lived experience and sectoral expertise from other NGOs or even community members, so that you actually have a better understanding of the current situation, a better understanding of kind of the root causes of the current situation. And also some of them might already have a clear sense on what to do as well. And so that's kind of a reason on having that kind of engagement as well. Now, I've been talking already a long time now, so I'm eager to hear again back from you, because we have a lot of wisdom already in the room here as well. And so eager to hear, if you go back to the slido.com, eager to hear from you whether there are other ways that you have experienced or that you would recommend your colleagues here to put people at the center to inform decisions about how we gather and how we gather data for protection monitoring. Any suggestions on how to put people at the center when you manage testing of the questionnaire? Very good. So yeah, you could have a questionnaire, an early draft, and then you test out with certain kind of community members or with sectoral experts on whether that resonates, whether it's aligned with the purpose. Again, consent. And again, key here is, of course, how to manage that. But it's also, I mean, the important element of consent is that consent quite often is individual, but also how do you take the community's interest into account? And so that might require additional kind of engagement that goes beyond consent as well. Testing of the inclusive data collection methods, having identify a steward, very important. Something that we work on a lot is this notion of data stewardship, so that you actually have someone that knows what data is already there, what's an appropriate question, and what's then the way to have it. Have qualified data collectors. Yes, we didn't even touch on that. How do you make sure that if data is collected, that you train and have qualified collectors so that you don't upset the communities, but also that you put people's interest at the center as well. Consider other data collection methods. Yeah, because this is also about being proportional in terms of methods, right? I mean, is the questionnaire actually the best method for collecting data or for creating the insight that is needed as well? Inclusive data collection methods was already mentioned as well. Great. Well, as you can see, a lot of wisdom is already in the room. And I think it's important to, and I think the message here is that it's important to think there is no one way of implementing that. And it's important to think kind of a menu of ways to implement the principles and to answer the questions. Now, the second stage is about sharing data, because quite often in humanitarian context, others might also need the data or need access to the data that you have collected. And that, of course, is also a fundamental opportunity of digital data, because digital data can actually be shared without loss of quality or even loss of control to a large extent as well. And so how do you start providing access to data that it can be reused? Now, obviously, that in itself creates all kinds of risks. And so it's important to, when you want to accommodate the request for data, to also assess the purpose, why you need access to the data, what is necessary to share, what is sensitive, and also do we need data sharing arrangements to de-risk the sharing or to provide access to data as well. And so here we're just going to focus on two kind of principles. First one is very common, of course, especially if you start sharing personal data, then a whole range of, as I said, data protection principles kick in. And some of the questions that you can ask here is, does the sharing align with the consent that was provided when the data was collected, or other legitimate basis for sharing, right? So it's important to think about, if you start providing access to data for other purposes, does it align with the consent that was acquired? Or do you need an additional social license, which is something that we work on as well, in order to actually provide access to data? How will data sharing be designed to respect and promote the rights? So how do you make sure that if you provide access to data, that the rights of data subjects and the data protection principles apply? That include to be informed about how the data is processed, even by others, how to be able to request access, correct, and delete data. What are the organizational and legal measures in place? How do you ensure security? Because anyway, especially when data is in transit, it can actually be potentially accessed by unauthorized persons. And how do you make sure that you have additional safeguards for sensitive personal data, which also, by the way, means that a key element to prepare data is also to start tagging certain kind of data in terms of sensitivity, right? So that when there is a request, you have also an understanding on what is sensitive, and also, of course, what might be problematic when you start sharing the data. Now, this can be done in a variety of ways. Quite often, of course, the common way to de-risk access to data is through a data sharing agreement, where you actually spell out what are the rights, what's the purpose, what is the data that is being shared. And so that's kind of course, a way to go about implementing the principle, taking the principle and implement it into kind of a contractual arrangement that de-risks the way to go about this. And this is, of course, important because it might impact your legitimacy, especially also your reputation. If you share it with others and then things go wrong, that ultimately, of course, might hamper your potential to work in the field. But also, of course, legal or ethical exposure is a key risk as well. The other principle when we talk about sharing protection monitoring data is, of course, to be transparent and accountable. And again, super important because that provides for kind of legitimacy as well. And so questions to ask here: how will refugees be informed? So how will you be transparent about the fact that you actually provide access to data for other actors for other purposes? How can we ensure that data sharing arrangements clearly specify the legitimate uses, right? So that's about being transparent and accountable. If we do not share the full data set, is there a risk that this will create bias? Because obviously, when you start putting data out of context, then you might actually create bias in how the data is being used that could be harmful. And so it's important to understand, is there a risk if we only share a part of the data, a risk as it relates to introducing bias in kind of the way data is going to be analyzed? And of course, do the data sharing arrangements include details that foster transparency as well? Important because it's about preventing discrimination. One of the key elements, of course, of also the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and also loss of agency might actually lead to additional kind of risks as well. So we've discussed how to implement some principles at the gathered data stage. We discussed at the shared data stage. And of course, another key step is, now that we have data, how are we going to start analyzing it and how we will do it in a responsible way? Now, this is, of course, when the data analysis stage comes in. And so here, it's important to go back to the reflection on, well, what is actually the question we seek to answer, right? As it relates to protection monitoring, which relates directly to the purpose, of course, so that you start analyzing it, and also that you have the appropriate analytical method, right? That it's not just, for instance, situation analysis or descriptive, but it could also be diagnostic. It could also be predictive, right? Do we actually need to know, based upon the information we have, do we want to also predict what might happen, which will require a more predictive analytical kind of tool. So key and important to actually take a step back and reflect on what is it that we need and how do we ensure we choose the right method, but how do we do this also in a responsible way? And again, all the principles kick in again, but here we're going to focus on two to operationalize that. One is, of course, data quality, right? And as I said, garbage in, garbage out, especially at the analytical stage. And so super important to make sure that data has been quality assured in terms of, as we already mentioned, those standards of accuracy, reliability, completeness. And so it's important to make sure that you have a clear sense on the quality of the data. Quite often that can be expressed also in metadata, or we've been advocating for kind of a nutritional label of data that really reflects what is actually the quality. And this becomes even more important as we are moving into, of course, artificial intelligence. But in addition to that, it's also about securing the data for analysis so that you have physical security, which means that sometimes you can only do the analysis at the premises where the data is stored. Technological security, which means that not everyone has access to the data, but you actually have profiles to restrict access to data based upon your mission or based upon your kind of role in the organization. And of course, procedural, which of course means that how do you get access? What are the procedures to determine who has access as well? So questions to ask here: how can we ensure data quality before the analysis? And again, this is about embedding a culture of data quality and also an assessment. How do we think about data quality also as disaggregation, which is again important to go back to what is it that you need to know? Do you need to know disaggregation at age group? Do you need to know disaggregation at sex? Anyway, do you want to know, for instance, a particular kind of protection monitoring as it relates to girls, as it relates to boys? Location, country of origin, and disability, but also sometimes disaggregation based upon health conditions as well. So a whole range of possible ways to actually disaggregate. And this is important to know because the level and the granularity of the insight will determine what kind of action and decisions you can make. And how do we keep data secure, such as, for instance, encrypting it, but also potentially reducing access as well. Again, super important because, as I said, garbage in, garbage out, and this will lead to flawed recommendations and flawed insight, which of course has an impact as well. And then the last principle I will touch upon as it relates to analyzing is again, specifically in the context of refugee children or children, which is how do we center the rights of refugee children, even at the stage of analysis, right? It's not just at the stage, again, of collection. And again, I already introduced those 4 areas. And so the questions to ask, for instance, are, does the analysis avoid reinforcing stereotypes or biases so that you really make sure that your analytical framework and method is not, and the data that you use is not actually introducing biases, which might lead to discrimination, which is, of course, a fundamental, non-discrimination is a fundamental principle and right attached to children. Are equity and fairness considered in the analysis so that you actually also take into account that it's not about one group, but that you do analysis that might benefit all? How is the privacy protected? Are measures in place to ensure data analysis is the best interest of children? Sometimes, it's not in the best interest to analyze something, frankly, because it might provide insight that can be abused. And how are children's views and feedbacks incorporated into the analysis process as well? So these are some of the questions, and that, anyway, ultimately can be answered in a variety of ways. For instance, if refugees are located in an area that is contested, would publishing data disaggregated by geography be harmful? And so that can be informed by really taking the context into account. And that ultimately will lead to taking the best interest of children into account. But also, anyway, can we engage with, for instance, other key informant in order to understand what children's views might be, what their expectations are, what their preferences are as well. And this, of course, anyway, if you not center the rights, that might lead to violations of privacy, loss of legitimacy again, lack of agency, and ultimately undermines trust in general as well. And so we've now covered all those stages, and I see there are a few questions already as it relates to the different stages of the data and information management process. But before we answer some of the questions, let me introduce Rachelle. I think you've been hearing now from this bearded person for quite a long time, so I'm sure you're ready for another voice and another perspective. And of course, Rachelle has been working on those issues for a very long time and has tremendous expertise in the region, in the sector. So over to you, Rachelle, to add some kind of additional reflections, but also perhaps feel free to start answering some of the questions that might be posed as well. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Stefaan, and thanks so much for the excellent presentation, and to all the participants who were able to join us today and share their insights and inputs through the Slido interaction. So as a quick recap of what we did today, we took a deep dive into what is data responsibility and why it matters for our work with and for refugee children. And we really look closely at the data responsibility principles and how they can be applied in practice. And as you may have seen on the slides, we also had a chance to take a quick look at some of the data responsibility actions that we have as well. And you'll find these in the YASC operational guidance that was mentioned earlier. And we encourage you to have a look at that guidance so you can see the second part of this data responsibility equation, which is on the one side, the principles, but also the 8 actions for data responsibility, things such as data management registries, data incident SOPs, and ecosystem mappings. So that's what we were able to do today. And in closing, I wanted to perhaps share some key thoughts and key points. So as humanitarian actors, of course, I hope today that it was really driven home that it's so important that we adopt data responsibility as our way of working, as our business as usual, since this is how our macro level ethos of do no harm is implemented and comes to life in the area of data. And this is important because we know that data has the potential, the great potential, to improve our response and the impact that it has, but it's not risk-free because people can be helped as well as harmed by data and our data management activities. And so by applying the data responsibility principles, what we aim to do is to maximize the benefits and minimize the harms that come from our data activities and try to balance these as much as possible. The second thought is we know that principles can sometimes seem very theoretical and abstract. And our hope today is that it was clear that the principles are meant to be real, practical guides that inform our everyday action with data. And that was the purpose of the example that Stefaan really took us through step by step to illustrate how principles are applied at key steps in the information management process. And yesterday it was interesting in the Q&A, one of the participants put a question in the comment box saying, isn't this theoretical, especially when bullets are flying? And it was a fantastic question, and I'm so glad he asked it, because the answer is yes. Even when the bullets are flying, we need to consider the principles. Otherwise, we will inevitably do harm or add to the harm. And I'd even go so far as to say that it's especially when the bullets are flying that data responsibility is the most important, when people-centered approaches are most important, because this is when people are most at risk, and we should not add to that risk and that harm through our data work. So this is where we can move to the invitation. where the invitation to all of you, to all of us in our everyday work, is to really proactively use the data responsibility principles to guide your decisions about what you're doing, with whom, why, where, and how. And Stefaan calls the principles the North Star, which is a wonderful analogy. I also like to think about them as glasses that we wear to understand and approach the world. Our ethical lenses is what we wear, and it tells us what is the right thing to do. Without my glasses, I cannot see, right? And the same way in my data work, I cannot see my data work without my principled approach. And the principles should really change our behavior. They should lead us to do things differently, to do them or to not even do them at all. And the example we have here is thinking to surveys, which of course are important data collection method in humanitarian context. But what happens is that if we're in a team and we realize that we have gaps in our information needs, we often have the reflex of running to a desk, typing out a questionnaire. That questionnaire often ends up being very long. And then we go out to the camp or to the site and we think, let us, administer this survey and get all the questions all the answers to the questions that we have. And the magic of the data responsibility principles is that they provide that pause and reflect moment. That pause and reflect moment to force us, in a positive sense, to check is this the right thing? So for example, instead of running out and conducting the survey, we would want to double check if the survey method is even appropriate and feasible in our context. We would want to check, since surveys are very expensive, if the investment required to conduct the survey is proportional to the expected utility of the information once we have it. And we may choose a different data collection method that has a better ratio between the effort required, the harm that may be caused, and the utility of the data. We may also decide to remove some questions from the survey, and I really hope that we would, so that we collect only the information that we don't already have and only the information that we absolutely need. We may also change the formulation of the questions, so these are asked in a way that avoids sensitive terms and uses context-appropriate terminology. We may choose to do the survey only at specific times of the day, in the morning, when usually it's safer, or in certain types of locations, for example, away from the market areas, so people are safe when they engage with us. We may hire enumerators that have a certain age, gender diversity profile to, again, enhance the well-being and safety of people who reply to the survey. And we may take time to really target the NGOs that have a proven experience working with communities from this refugee group. We may refuse to share some or all the data. And what's even more exciting is that we may need to share it even more widely. So these are some examples about how that data responsibility lens really leads us to a pause and reflect moment to recalibrate what it is that we're doing and make sure we're doing the right thing. And it's not about restricting our data work. Being responsible doesn't mean that we don't collect data or that we don't share data. It's about doing it in a different way, in a more ethical way, in a safe way, in a responsible way. So I hope that today we were able, together with all these components, to demystify data responsibility, and that you feel ready to dive deeper into the topic and apply the principles and the actions in your everyday work. Let me just say thanks to all of you for joining us, and thanks again to Stefaan, Andrew, and Sarah from the GovLab, as well as Eugenia and Krisana from UNICEF. And now I can hand over for, we have some additional resources that we've compiled for you, and of course, as well, the Q&A. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Rachelle. And yeah, so before we go into the questions, we realized that what we introduced today is a lot. and might require further kind of reflection as well. And so that's why we developed a compilation of additional resources that we will share in the chat, but also we will share to all of you, all the ones that were registered, together with the recording and the slides as well. So some of you already were requesting whether the slides will be shared. That will be shared with all the ones that took part today as well, and that might register. And of course, we will also put that on our website so that you can download it then as well. Now, as it relates to the questions, thanks for Abdul Ganiu and Sophie for adding a few questions in the Q&A. As it relates to the first question, obviously we would be delighted to collaborate. And clearly, those principles, I could have done a presentation on how to develop an IRB as it relates to research, and you would have seen that many of those principles also apply to actually doing research, especially as it relates to research on children, which are kind of the similar kind of principles that are being used by kind of research review bodies as it relates to independent research bodies, as review bodies, as it relates to whether research is ethical in the context of children as well. And so happy to follow up. We will, I think, Andrew, perhaps if you could put one of our emails from the Data Stewards initiative, or the RD4C initiative, into the chat here so that people can follow up as well. But happy to look into that. Now, as it relates to the second question, thanks again, Sophie. Let me ask Rachelle to answer that question. I mean, anyway, happy to answer that as well. But but I think, Rachelle, you might have, given the fact that you've worked with the data and information management process concept for a long time. Over to you.
Yes, and thanks very much for the question. So there are a few bits. The data sharing moment is really about the raw data. Before it is analyzed. Once it's analyzed, we usually talk about it in terms of findings, conclusions, recommendations. These are often the analytical outputs or the outputs of the analysis process. And that's often documented in reports, be they internal or external. And we're in a different step of the IM process, which is about communication and dissemination. Here, we're really talking about the data set. And as you point out, there are different versions of the data sets. There's the raw version, there's the clean version, then there's the version of the data set with personal data, and you would have as well the anonymized or anonymous version of the data set. So a principled approach would, one, encourage us to make those distinctions, because the rules that apply, notably with regards to data protection and privacy, would be different if the data set includes personal data or non-personal data. And we have to prompt ourselves to, as you do, think about the risks of sharing those different versions with different actors for different purposes. And are these legitimate or not? Or is the defined purpose clear, et cetera, et cetera? So this kind of analysis is what we do when designing the data activity. So one of the first steps in the IM process is to design our activity. Yes, define purposes and information needs. And then that comes with designing the process about how we're going to collect the data, what are the methods, systems, processes, and tools to go through, collect, analyze, store, share, use, visualize. And in that design moment is when we need to answer the question about sharing and responsible sharing, because once an organization comes knocking on our door, it's too late, and we don't have the time to think through these questions that the data responsibility principles prompt us to ask. So I hope that helps.
Great. Thanks so much, Rachelle. And thanks again, Sophie and Abdul Ganiu, for the questions. Not sure whether there are other questions as well. If not, as I mentioned, feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions. We will make the recording, the slides, and the additional resources also publicly available. And thank you all for spending 90 minutes in your busy schedule with us to really focus on data responsibility, and especially data responsibility as it relates to refugee children, because it's only by leveraging data that we can improve their lives, but we need to do it, of course, also in a responsible manner for sure. So with that, thanks everyone for joining. We will have another session tomorrow because we have 3 sessions to accommodate the different time zones. So feel free to, if you want another repetition, feel free to join that. But more importantly, feel free to also share what you've learned with your colleagues, or share the link to tomorrow's event with your colleagues if you feel that they might benefit also from taking part to that as well. Thank you so much, and we will be in touch.